Donald Trump ambushed South African President Cyril Ramaphosa in the White House. But here's what no one's telling you. It could backfire spectacularly. Want to know why? Let's find out. Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX. I'm Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh, and on this channel we explore South African politics through interviews and analysis. Nowhere else to start than this ambush White House meeting that happened last week. I still want to digest and process it with you all and give you a perspective that you wouldn't have seen anywhere else. In today's video, I'm going to explain why I think Donald Trump's ambush of Cyril Ramaphosa is going to backfire for Trump, both in terms of global politics and domestically. I'm also going to reflect on the meeting from the South African perspective and paint it in a longer context of why South Africa also failed to claim and seize that moment. Now, the first thing I want to do is take a look at the context of what happened in the White House, because I've been doing a lot of thinking about that moment. I did an immediate reaction, but I've been thinking about it a bit more since then. Second, I then want to look at why I think it's going to backfire for Trump, geopolitically and domestically. And then finally, I want to look at it from the South African perspective. How did we react to that meeting? What should we do from here? And is a true reset on the cards? And ultimately, I also want to say that I think the South African government failed to really seize the moment and that no real reset is in sight. But let's start here. Let's kick things off with what actually happened in the White House, because there's been a lot of talk about how South Africa responded in South Africa. Was the president calm? Should he have pushed back more? Should we have come with more facts to the table? And yes, I think we didn't quite rebut and refute the allegations diplomatically as we could have. But I think it's a diversion to talk about how South Africa should have responded. How could Donald Trump do that? How could Donald Trump attempt in a premeditated way to try and ambush, shame, and humiliate a leader like that, a world leader like that? I just think there's something twisted about the whole way this White House meeting was conceived, and we need to put some pressure on that before we think about the South African response to it. Like, I wonder to myself sometimes, can you imagine if the shoe was on the other foot? Let's imagine for 1 second that President Ramaphosa invited Donald Trump to the Union Buildings, South Africa's seat of power. But he was like, you can't come unless you bring Tiger Woods and Michael Jordan, because I can only hear you if you bring black athletes who know how to speak to me as a black president. So can you imagine for a second if South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, if the shoe was on the other foot, invited Donald Trump to the Union Buildings, the seat of South African power, and he said, you can come, but you have to bring Tiger Woods and Michael Jordan, because I just think I need to hear you through the mouths of black American athletes. And then imagine President Ramaphosa sat down the US delegation and said, unbeknownst to them, oh, somebody cut the lights. I want to play video evidence of police brutality on black Americans. I want to show you US differential wealth statistics. I want to show you the effects of Jim Crow on segregation in cities like Baltimore and Washington, D.C. and New York. And I want you to explain to me why there's some kind of genocide against black people and what you're doing about it. And I want to read off these statistics and look at these fake printouts. They'd have got up and walked out. I mean, it would never have happened, but for South Africa then to turn around and say, oh, this meeting was a victory because we kept our calm, it just helps us to see that this was a coordinated, premeditated attempt to assault the South African people, embarrass the South African people, and humiliate the South African people, especially through the figure of their president. Like, they sat there in the Trump administration and they were like, how are we going to do this? First, I've got an idea. Let's play a video of that politician who wears the red hat, the Malema. Yeah, let's play the Malema video, like live there. We'll wheel in a TV and play the Malema. Yeah, let's play the Malema video. And then we'll bring in those crosses, and And yeah, we got him. We got him. That's what we're going to do. They clearly knew this and didn't inform the South African delegation and then sprung this thing on them. And they had obviously had some pre-meeting. And as my producer said, you could see Trump sitting there like, we got him. We got him. It's a really twisted thing to do. And I mean, in diplomatic circles, like, you just don't spring these public surprises on people. And to see people on the far right celebrating this kind of thing is really worrying, because it's a race to the bottom of who can create the biggest circus and who can create the biggest humiliation. And believe me, there's enough humiliation and shame to go around. If other countries start getting brave, they might just start playing that game. And right now, other countries are turning the other cheek and being dignified. But I just thought, like, one thing I wanted to say is what a setback this is for the dignity of the Oval Office, what a setback this is for the image of the United States, and what a terribly cruel thing to do, to try to, bring a black African president into the White House and make him feel the small. But I don't think Trump necessarily succeeded in doing that because of the backlash against it. So the first thing we just need to, I think, sit with is how bad of a move that was from the US. South Africa went there hoping to reset relations, and one thing we really need to appreciate is the US doesn't want to reset relations, and we need to accept that now. It feels like South Africa is begging someone who has made up their mind, and we still think that we can persuade and cajole, whereas we need to move to a policy, in my view, of damage limitation and dignity maintenance in the process. But I'll get on to what we can expect from them later. So I just wanted to say that and focus in on that for a while. And this happens in a deeper context of an all-out coordinated campaign to ambush and embarrass South Africa on the international stage. The White House thing was just one example. We've had tweets coming from Trump. We've had Rubio saying they're not coming to the G20. We've had an embarrassing ejection of our ambassador, Ibrahim Rasool, from Washington. He's probably sitting there vindicated, saying, see, it was part of a campaign to embarrass South Africa. Anyone could have said anything and they were just looking to embarrass us. They refuse to accept Mcebisi Jonas now, who's our next ambassador that we've sent. So this is part of a long chain of events building up to the big embarrassing moment in the White House. And I thought that moment will go down in infamy as a moment of shame in the Oval Office and in Washington. And future generations will probably look back on it with a sense of shock and disappointment. So having said that, I want to turn to why I think this is actually going to backfire on Trump, like so many things have backfired on Trump before. So let's come on to the US context now. And ever since this White House meeting, it's as if people in the US have suddenly woken up to just how crazy the Trump administration's antagonism of South Africa actually is. And you're seeing some big voices, some big media platforms belatedly finally come onto the table and provide a corrective to this wild narrative of white genocide that the Trump administration seems intent on pushing. I want you to have a look at this from Pod Save America. Ben Rhodes, a former Obama aide, came out with a very stinging statement showing why antagonizing South Africa doesn't make geopolitical sense for the United States. Have a look at this.
South Africa is a big, important country. They're part of the BRICS coalition. There's an S at the end of BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Like, they are a leader in the African Union. If we care about all the stuff Trump says he cares about, like, critical minerals and supply chains and raw materials and competing with China, humiliating and being a fucking racist to the president of South Africa in the Oval Office is a good way of ensuring that the United States has absolutely no influence whatsoever in the continent of Africa for the rest of our lives. And that's what a fucking genius, move by Trump, right? Like, just to appeal to some Proud Boys and Elon Musk and people like that in his coalition, he basically just ensured that the United States is not is seen as a hostile, racist, white supremacist power.
I couldn't agree more. And there you see Rhodes saying South Africa is an important country. It's the S in BRICS. It's a key player on the African continent. It's a key economy on the African continent. And at a time where the US is becoming increasingly isolated, where we're seeing splits between the US and Europe over things like Russia and Ukraine, over tariff policy, when you're seeing China being more assertive on the world stage, when you're seeing Russia being more assertive on the world stage, the last thing the US needs is to take a country like South Africa, which hasn't been fighting with the US at all. Maybe it's taken some opposing positions, but countries are allowed to take opposing positions in international fora. That's why they're international fora. They're there exactly so countries can express themselves within pre-agreed rules. So there's no rule that South Africa has to agree with the US on everything. But, South Africa certainly hasn't been antagonizing the US in any way. And then suddenly the US decides to make an enemy of South Africa by just embarrassing us. I don't think that that's, in terms of the Trump, to the extent that the Trump administration appreciates the geopolitical importance of Africa in the global economy and the future importance of Africa in the world, to the extent that he appreciates that, this is not going to suit US interests at all. It's going to set US interests a generation back because of how much ill feeling Trump is creating in intentionally trying to humiliate African leaders, and particularly the South African leader. And a lot of people in South Africa and a lot of people right now on the right, the white right in the West and in the US are gloating. They feel like they have the world in the palm of their hands and they can say anything because the MAGA megaphone gives them this unlimited currency. But that's not going to last forever. We know the first Trump administration ended in tears. And we know that, judging by the start of this Trump administration, this one could end in tears too. And then where will people be, both in South Africa and abroad, when this ends in tears? It's just a very short-term operation to think that this Trump moment is going to last forever. And then we have to ask ourselves, what kind of damage will this Trump moment do? So we've got a very interesting moment in which the US is becoming increasingly isolated. It's antagonizing its allies, like Canada and the UK. Serious disputes on what's going on in Europe, as I say. And this is at a time when rivals are rising to really challenge US power. So I just think the US can ill afford to go out and make enemies of friends. Also, having said that, there's a serious domestic play that we need to consider right now, because this is starting to backfire on Trump domestically. For example, he's being lampooned and pilloried and made fun of on really big late-night talk shows now. Take a look at how The Daily Show made fun of just his ignorance on South Africa.
President Trump's meeting with the president of South Africa today. And because it's Donald Trump, things got weird.
Death, 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 horrible death, death, I don't know.
What a host!
So, as we can see, people in the US are starting to wake up to this problem. And I want to show you Trump's poll numbers, because if you compare them to where Trump was before, and we know that didn't go very well, it's in a similar place to his last presidency. He's underwater in his approval rating. He's beneath where Obama was. He's beneath where Biden was. So domestically, the Trump moment is already the bloom is off the rose of the Trump moment in the US. And a lot of this is just that he came in promising that the economy would, make this miraculous turnaround, that prices would fall, that inflation would be kept in check. He said he would solve the Russia-Ukraine war within like a day. And he said that he would reassert the US's role in the world. What's happening? The US is getting weaker. Countries are moving away from the US because they're being forced to. Inflation is not down. A recession is on the cards. But the tariff chaos has turned off a lot of loyal MAGA Trump voters. And really, his poll numbers show that he's quite unpopular right now in the US as well. So when South Africa addresses Trump and when other countries address Trump, they shouldn't address him as if he is this all-powerful authoritarian dictator in the US. Yes, he scored a really important electoral victory 6 months ago, but things change and they shift in US politics, and they can shift very quickly. So not only is he much less popular right now than he was in November last year, but when we think about the next 18 months, if Republicans lose the House in the US, then he'll be very much on the road to lame duck status. And that's when things really went badly for him in his last term, because when Democrats took the House in 2018, last time, they were able to bring out investigations, they were able to put gum in the works of his agenda, and they were able to effectively foil a lot of what he was trying to do. So what I'm trying to say is that this Trump moment is going to be temporary, it's going to be painful, but there's no guarantee that it's going to be a good thing for US standing in the world, US standing in Africa, let alone Trump's own domestic policy. And when Trump goes this time, he's gone. He can't resurrect himself as he miraculously did last time. And then the question is, that's when I think South Africa could have a real reset. That's when the world will have a real reset. And hopefully we'll have a wiser US president who then has to mend relationships with the rest of the world. But South Africa just in some ways needs to sit tight. It's going to be a bumpy ride for the next 3.5 years, but it's not a ride that South Africa will not be able to outlive. I also just have to say that there's this big attempt right now in Western right-wing, white-leaning media to try and create this echo chamber. But when you really look at what's being said, it's crazy, it doesn't make any sense, and it's completely ill-informed. And some of that also just needs to be called out at the moment, because there's clearly this coordinated media attack using these big sites, your Ben Shapiro's, your Jordan Petersons, to try and create this feeling as if there's a swing in public opinion. But I can't believe that people are watching this and actually being swayed. I want you to take a look at some of the silly stuff that we're hearing. Here's this guy, Matt Walsh, no relation, who can't even pronounce Cyril Ramaphosa's name, who thinks he has a view on South Africa.
Ever since the death of Nelson Mandela, it's fair to call Cyril Ramaphosa one of the few surviving founding fathers of post-apartheid South Africa.
Cyril Ramaphosa. Sorry, I just had to throw that in there because this is the level of that we're dealing with. He obviously only heard about Cyril Ramaphosa 5 minutes ago, but suddenly he's got this deep take on South Africa, which he, probably couldn't place on a map last month. But because it's now a MAGA issue, suddenly all these US conservative thinkers are experts on South African history. Let's take a look at the actual views and you'll see how misguided they are.
He certainly didn't tell anyone that he eventually planned to sign new laws that would disenfranchise and rob white farmers, or that white people would be systematically slaughtered in their homes.
Okay, so according to Matt Walsh, the South African Constitution was just written overnight by Cyril Ramaphosa, and Cyril Ramaphosa just decided that secretly he was going to surreptitiously create this persecution of white. What is this nonsense? Number one, the South African constitutional process has been long documented. It took a number of years. There was a parliamentary assembly that came together. Cyril Ramaphosa was an important ANC negotiator, but by no means was he the only person putting his views into the South African Constitution. There's a long debate about the South African Constitution within South Africa. Parliament democratically passes laws, and there's absolutely zero evidence for any premeditated idea that there would be white persecution in South Africa. That's partly because you can't have a premeditated idea for something that's not happening, because there is no concerted, systematic white persecution in South Africa. But, this laughable idea that laws in South Africa just get passed based on what Cyril Ramaphosa had for breakfast is laughable. So it's just nonsense. It's just people coming out trying to project confidence about things they know absolutely nothing about. For another example, let's take a look at Jordan Peterson. of crustacean fame, the man who compares the human psyche to that of lobsters. This is his view on apartheid South Africa. One of the most heinous crimes in the 20th century, a crime which subjugated millions of black people, people unjustifiably imprisoned, many of them given the death penalty for speaking out and being activists against the system of racial domination, a system which confined black South Africans who made up between 60 and 70% of the population into 13% of the land, put them into the margins of society, racially discriminated against them in terms of the workplace, in terms of employment opportunities, in terms of the amenities they could have, in terms of education, in terms of healthcare, systematically undermined their life prospects for multiple generations with apartheid and violent colonialism before. If we really want to talk about genocides, we can, but we're going to have to start the clock at a different time to 5 minutes ago in South Africa, because there were war crimes committed in this country. There were crimes against humanity committed in South Africa. They were committed against the black population. And what did the black population do in response? They didn't rise and say, now it's time for revenge. You systematically subjugated all of our ancestors through violent dispossession and legislative means. They came together in a constitutional assembly with Cyril Ramaphosa, and they said, we're going to chart a new future, a united country, but one thing is going to have to happen in this united country. Those who have all the wealth are going to have to share some of it. And many people said that they weren't forced, those who had the wealth, especially white South Africans, weren't forced to share enough. And that's why 30 years later, we sit in a situation where, although we had a democratic transition, we have not had an economic transition. But this is what Jordan Peterson thinks was wrong about the transition to apartheid. He thinks what was wrong was that there were sanctions against the apartheid government, and that it was wrong to create a political transition because it would unleash forces that would hurt and harm not all South Africans, but white South Africans. This is his view.
Apartheid was a major issue, and we should let everybody listening and watching know what the apartheid state was exactly, so we get that clear. But there was immense pressure, especially from the more radical end of the political belief spectrum, to divest any investment in South Africa, to put pressure on the government to dispense with apartheid. And I watched that and I thought, well, apartheid's a pretty brutal regime and it has its marked catastrophic disadvantages, but you bloody radicals, you're messing with things you don't understand and you're virtue signaling like mad, and you're not going to have to bear the consequences of your idiot interference. Because I figured, and I still do, that the most likely outcome for South Africa is that because of the vast disparities in population size and distribution of wealth, is that the white South Africans are going to find themselves in serious trouble. Now, that already happened in Zimbabwe.
So really, we sit with a situation where there is this white right echo chamber bubble, which can only see the pain and suffering of white South Africans and refuses to see the generational and present suffering of black South Africans. And let me make one thing abundantly clear. The trauma of violent crime is a terrible thing and it afflicts South African society, but it doesn't afflict any one group specially. There's no systematic genocide just because a violent crime happens to happen in a place where there is a white South African, when black South Africans also, and in fact bear the disproportionate, and black South African women mainly, bear the disproportionate brunt of crime. The problem with the white genocide myth is that it takes the trauma of South Africans, of all races, and it weaponizes it into a racially divisive fairy tale that somehow there's some conspiracy to only affect white South Africans when white South Africans are not disproportionately affected. Now, there's this idea that because crime happens on farms, that it's targeting white people, But that just begs the question, well, why are so many farms owned by white people? And that's because of South Africa's history of violent racial land dispossession. So if you agree that the vast majority of farmers are white people, well, then you have to then ask yourself why that's the case. But I can assure you that if for some reason there wasn't that history of dispossession, it's not like crime would go away and criminals would stop attacking farms. It's because there's wealth and there's resources on those farms, and South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in the world. And so criminals go where the money is. They also do that in suburbs. They do that in apartment complexes. They do that in wealthy areas, on wealthy streets. There's nothing special about the trauma that is suffered by white South Africans. It's terrible. And as someone who is a South African, I've suffered the traumas of crime too. I'm not saying to those people who've suffered crime that their experiences don't matter. But I have a problem when you say that my experience matters so much that it's a special category of experience because I'm a white person, and that there's some deep conspiracy to persecute me when everyone is experiencing the same crime at the same time. So this white persecution myth is just, it's been debunked so many times, but we've got to keep doing the work. And now we've got to turn attention to some of these international figures because they know even less about South Africa than some of the people peddling those myths here. And I stand ready. If anyone would like to discuss this with me, Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, I'm here. Like, I will debate any one of these American people who know nothing about South Africa and put the facts to them, because the smiling approach is not going to work. So some of the stuff needs to be called out and just refuted and rebutted. So that's what I'm trying to do here. Now, I want to finally talk about the South African context, because I still think there's some stuff we need to think about based on what happened at the White House the other day. Okay, so let's come on to part 3. What does this mean for South Africa still? And I want to distill my thoughts into 3 categories here. Number 1, how we reacted at the White House. I've done a lot of that, but I just want to give a brief reflection. Number 2, the role of oligarchs in South African society, the pressure they're able to exert on policy, and why that's a bad thing. And then thirdly, also just to look at what did South Africa win, if anything, or what kind of gains should we be looking to hold on to, particularly from the perspective of trade? Now, in South Africa, there is this strange notion that we should celebrate that the president did not get hot under the collar. And like, I'm all for composure, and I think it's a great thing, but we shouldn't conflate remaining composed with a foreign policy victory. Because our goal, and the way that this was sold to us as a country, was that we were going there to reset relations. Finally, we were going to have Trump in the same room, and we were going to have this PR opportunity to show that despite all that's been said, we can now move forward on a common agenda. And the fact of the matter is that didn't happen at the White House. If anything, the contrary happened. And yes, we kept our cool while the contrary happened, but the fact that the US wanted to embarrass us should show us that they're not interested in any kind of reset. Now, I've seen some people saying that, yeah, that's all theatrics, it's optics, and it's theater, but the real stuff is trade. And my response to that is, you think trade and geopolitics are disconnected in the Trump era? The way that Trump characterizes South Africa in the theater has a spillover effect onto economic relations. And there's no way that the US is going to have a policy of trying to shame South Africa on the one hand, but then trade with South Africa or increase trade links with South Africa on the other. So there's that. But just the composition of the people who went into the White House. We bent over backwards to try and create this delegation, and maybe through Trump's pressure as well, because Ramaphosa intimated that Trump wanted the golfers there. But then, of course, we would have agreed to that. You know, you can't have a diplomatic meeting where someone says, hey, I'd like these people to be there, and then, you know, you say, okay, fine, you can bring whoever you want. So we clearly agreed to the composition of who we had there, and it was a very unrepresentative composition of South Africa. And I'm not just talking racially or gender, because there were only 2 women in the room there out of, I think, a delegation of about 7 or 8. But just wealth-wise. Like, what's the point of us having elections so that we can invest power in public representatives to speak for us, especially when the country is under attack? And then when push comes to shove, we just send billionaires and oligarchs into the room to speak for us. Now, I'm not saying that they don't have influence, but there's a key question of democratic representation here. Who speaks for South Africa? And who is able to put our views across in the room when push comes to shove? And, there's been a lot of talk about the influence of private power and oligarchs on South African policy. And maybe some of us thought that was overblown and it was all conspiratorial, but one thing has become clear. We just don't know the influence of billionaires on South African policy. And the wealthy 0.001% have such a say over what happens in this country that sometimes you wonder what the point of elections even is. President Ramaphosa himself is a wealthy South African rand billionaire. Then we had Johann Rupert in the room. We heard that Patrice Motsepe was instrumental. I'm not sure how true this was in the preparation. So 3 billionaires. Then Trump is a billionaire and a president. And then Elon Musk is a billionaire. And it's like, well, why don't we just give the world to billionaires then to run? Because even in these political spaces where democratic legitimacy is supposed to be important, that's literally where diplomats get their legitimacy from. It just feels like South Africa would rather project a different narrative of itself. And I'm not sure what the point of our democratic breakthrough was if people of South Africa don't get the same kind of voice as billionaires. And we saw that with this Starlink situation that has now emerged, because no sooner had the White House meeting finished than suddenly the Minister of Communications issues this draft policy and gazettes a draft policy which is going to effectively create a loophole for Elon Musk's Starlink in South Africa. Now, here's my view on this. Before all of this aggression towards South Africa from Elon Musk and the Trump administration, I was quite interested in Starlink because I think that South Africa has the potential to really grow as an economy if we can expand access to internet infrastructure, data, and communication, especially in rural areas, townships, even informal settlements. If we can open the doors of access to information, I think that would be a great thing. But there is a way to do that. And for me, the process by which we have apparently been bullied into this policy shift suggests to me that it's not so much about the South African government trying to open the doors of access to the people who need it the most. It's the South African government capitulating to pressure from people who don't even like South Africa. And when someone is as openly hostile towards you as Elon Musk has been, I mean, Elon Musk is not hiding that he doesn't really like South Africa as a place. He thinks that there is some kind of reverse apartheid going on where either white people are being persecuted or at the very least treated unfairly. And he is specifically singled out because he's not black. By the way, not being black seems to have done quite well for him in the world and in his life. But hey, the wealthiest person in the world is still complaining about not being able to get even more. Which is amazing. And then at the same time, people talk about victim mentality. At what point do you stop becoming a victim when you're the wealthiest person in the world, and yet you still feel like you are being victimized by other people? So Elon Musk's Starlink thing doesn't sit well with me anymore because it feels like some kind of strong arm tactic, and even worse, it feels like our government has given way to this strong arm tactic. And my question is, there are national security questions about communications infrastructure and having such a strategic role in the information that goes in and out of a country. We've seen in the Russia-Ukraine conflict how Elon Musk's Starlink has actually been crucial to Ukraine, but how he's actually also been able to leverage that for geopolitical ends. And so my question to South Africa and the government would be, and I know that this is just a gazette and it's for public comment, so here's my public comment. Why would we open ourselves up to an actively hostile person when this technology can be found elsewhere? I do think we should have enough dignity as a country to say that your technology is wonderful, but if you're actively hostile to the principles of our constitution and you actively participate in the humiliation and embarrassment of our country, we don't need the technology. We can find it somewhere else, from someone else. And so I'm just not sure what this big stampede to get Starlink is when, number one, if you speak to some of our African compatriots, they're not really that happy with the service. Number two, there's no guarantee that it's actually going to have the developmental impact that we want it to. Number three, it might be quite expensive right at the beginning. But more importantly, number four, the person who owns it is just hostile to South Africa and what we stand for. So the Starlink thing, just the procedure and the process doesn't sit well with me anymore. And I just wish our government could have a backbone at some point. Like, we're being tossed left and right. We're smiling along while, other countries in the world are getting serious about their foreign policy and actually achieving things. We are hoping that maybe if we persuade and smile and cajole and pamper those who are being aggressive to us, that we will somehow make it out in the end. And the reason for that is because we've been left in a weak position by our government. The economy is not growing, unemployment is rife, crime is rife, and at some point we do have to have a conversation as a country about how this ANC-led government has made us so weak that we can be pushed and shoved around by not countries, by individuals. And that's a sad and a sorry state to be. So this Starlink thing, I don't think we should panic too much. It's a draft for comment. There will be comment. Opposition parties will have their say. It looks very unpopular to me on a first reading. And there'll be a very big debate in South Africa about how we are able to create loopholes and when we create loopholes and for whom we create those loopholes and why now and why for this particular question. So those questions will need to be answered in due course. So in today's episode, I've tried to take another look at Donald Trump's ambush of Cyril Ramaphosa in the White House and to argue that, number one, I think it's going to backfire in the fullness of time geopolitically and domestically for Trump. It's also going to show that many of his allies in conservative media bubbles, once you really look into what they're saying, are building their arguments on sand, and there's nothing really, they don't seem to know much about South Africa in any case. Secondly, that in the South African context, there's still a lot of questions to answer about how we are negotiating this. We weren't perfect in the White House. Our foreign policy hasn't been perfect. Our government is not perfect at the moment. But at the same time, we're still a serious country with serious interests and one that has a population that can never be counted out. And the bullying of Trump and Elon Musk may hurt in the short term, but it's not going to destroy the South African people in the long term because we're just we're too resilient and dynamic for that. So, like, share, subscribe, get yourself some SMWX merch, drop a comment in the comments below. Let's see what you think. Help us get to 250,000 subscribers and keep it locked, as ever, on SMWX. Aye.